Hello everyone. Tonight we are diving into one of those stories that makes you wonder how much trouble a single determined human being can cause for the most powerful empire of its time. Spoiler alert, quite a lot, but don't worry, you will not survive the suspense. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And I mean really. If not, that's fine. But Spartacus might be just a little disappointed. Also, let me know in the comments where you are and what time it is for you right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soft background music. And let's get started tonight. The arena smelled of sweat, sand, and something vaguely resembling old goat cheese, not exactly the kind of scent that makes you want to hang around. In the gladiator school at Capua, hundreds of men were forced to spend their days learning how to kill each other for entertainment. Spartacus, a tall Thracian with a gaze like sharpened steel, had been here long enough to understand the rules. The first rule: survive the training. The second: never forget you are property. He had not always been a gladiator. Historians still debate whether he had once served in the Roman army before becoming a prisoner, or whether he'd been captured in some skirmish along Rome's unruly borders. Either way, the end result was the same: a collar around his neck, and the promise of a short, bloody career. The lanista, or gladiator trainer, was a man whose idea of a good morning involved yelling until his voice cracked, then yelling some more. His name was Gladiators, and he ran the school with the precision of a miser counting coins. Each fighter was valuable, but only as long as he kept drawing crowds. If he got too injured to fight, well, let's just say the Romans were not big on retirement plans for gladiators. Spartacus was good. Not just good with a sword, but good at reading people. He learned who could be trusted with a secret and who would run straight to the guards. And most importantly, he learned patience. Because in a place where you were beaten for breathing too loudly, patience was your only real weapon. Still, there were cracks in the walls. Not literal ones, those had been repaired, but human cracks. Food rations went missing. Wooden practice swords were found where real ones should be. And sometimes, in the dead of night, the sound of muffled voices carried through the thin walls of the barracks. One evening, after a particularly brutal sparring session where Spartacus had accidentally on purpose knocked his opponent flat with a blow that was technically not allowed, he sat by the small barred window in his cell. Through it, he could see the fading sun, and for just a moment, he let himself imagine walking freely under that sky. It wasn't the first time, but it was the first time he felt that imagining wasn't enough. Nearby, another gladiator named Crixus, a massive Gaul with the subtlety of a charging bull, sat gnawing on a piece of stale bread. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" he muttered without looking up. "If you're thinking about stealing the trainer's lunch tomorrow." "No," Spartacus replied. Crixus smirked. "Not lunch, freedom." Spartacus didn't answer right away. He simply looked out the window again. Somewhere beyond those walls, beyond the sands of the arena, lay the open road. And somewhere along that road, there was a place where no one would call him a slave. He didn't know how yet, but the thought was there now, sharper than any sword. That night, he lay awake listening to the snores, coughs, and occasional muttered curses of his fellow gladiators. The arena had been his world for too long, but deep down, he knew that even the cruelest of worlds could be broken open if you hit it in the right place. And Spartacus, he was starting to think he'd found just such a place. The morning air in Capua was brisk, but inside the gladiator school, it was all heat and noise. Wooden swords cracked against shields, instructors barked orders, and somewhere in the corner, a trainee was throwing up, either from exhaustion or breakfast. No one could tell. Spartacus moved through the drills with the same focused precision as always, but his mind was elsewhere. The idea had taken root. Freedom. Crixus had brought it up almost casually, like discussing the weather. But the more Spartacus thought about it, the more it seemed possible. Not easy, definitely not easy, but possible. And once you see the smallest crack in your chains, it's hard to unsee it. A few days later, in the sweat-soaked chaos of another training session, Spartacus started quietly testing the waters. He spoke in low tones to a few men he trusted. Inamouse, the seasoned African fighter who could kill a man with a glance. Castus and Gannicus, both as reckless as they were skilled. The responses were mixed. Some laughed and said it was madness. Others listened. The plan forming in Spartacus's mind was simple. but only in theory. Overpower the guards, grab real weapons from the storeroom, and make a run for it before anyone could raise the alarm. The problem: the school was heavily guarded, the gates were reinforced, and escaping gladiators tended to end up nailed to crosses along the Appian Way. Not the kind of vacation anyone wanted. Still, cracks kept appearing in Batiatus's iron grip. A shipment of new swords was due to arrive soon, and they'd be stored in the armory before being distributed. That armory was usually locked tight, but during deliveries, the guards could be distracted, especially if someone provided a distraction that involved loud yelling and possibly throwing something heavy. Historians still debate whether this plan was months in the making or thrown together in a matter of days. What they agree on is that it all came to a head when someone, to this day, no one knows who, smuggled in kitchen knives. Not exactly the best weapon against armored soldiers, but sharper than the practice blades they were usually stuck with. One evening, while the men were sitting in the dimly lit mess hall, Spartacus leaned across the table to "It has to be soon," he whispered. Crixus grinned. "Tomorrow? Too soon. The day after." From the other end of the table, Gannicus, who had the remarkable ability to drink wine like water, muttered, "Why not tonight?" before promptly passing out face first into his stew. Spartacus ignored him, though he couldn't help a small smile. A successful escape would require timing, speed, and a little bit of luck. And maybe, just maybe, a drunken Gannicus could count as luck if things got desperate. The day before the planned breakout, tension hummed through the barracks. Every clang of a sword, every shout from a guard seemed sharper than usual. Spartacus could feel eyes on him, some curious, some suspicious. He kept his voice low, his movements steady, trying not to give anything away. That night, as the others drifted into restless sleep, Spartacus stayed awake, counting heartbeats, listening to the wind outside. Somewhere, an owl hooted, and he found himself thinking how free that bird was to come and go as it pleased. Then he remembered that owls also ate mice, and the thought lost some of its charm. Morning came too quickly. The men went through their drills, but everyone in on the plan was on edge. Gannicus accidentally broke a training sword in half. Inamos kept scanning the gates, as though expecting them to open at any moment. When the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Spartacus knew it was time. The delivery wagon would be arriving soon, and with it, their one real shot. Somewhere deep in his chest, excitement wrestled with fear. This was it. After tonight, he'd either be free, or not, breathing at all. And if there was one thing Spartacus hated more than slavery, it was losing. The sun was slipping low, painting the sky in streaks of gold and orange, when the rumble of wooden wheels and the clatter of hooves broke through the evening noise. The weapons delivery had arrived right on schedule. A cart, drawn by two tired-looking mules, guarded by a couple of soldiers who looked even more tired. Spartacus caught Crixus's eye from across the training yard. No words were needed. This was the moment. The cart rolled through the gates, the guards at the entrance, barely glancing at the contents. After all, who would dare steal from Batiatus's prized gladiator school? It was the kind of place where troublemakers mysteriously retired to unmarked graves. The plan's first step fell to Gannicus, which, in retrospect, may not have been the wisest choice. But luck was with them. Gannicus had been saving a truly spectacular display of drunken recklessness for just this occasion. He staggered into the yard, slurring insults at one of the instructors, then tried to prove his superior swordsmanship with a broom handle. Within moments, the yard was a scene of shouts, laughter, and half-hearted attempts to restrain him. While the distraction took hold, Spartacus, Crixus, and Inamos slipped toward the armory. The heavy wooden door was bolted, but one of the kitchen knives fit snugly into the latch. The crude lockpick job took only seconds, either because Spartacus was quick, or because the lock was older than the city of Rome itself. Inside, racks of gleaming swords, spears, and shields waited like long-lost friends. The men's eyes lit up, and for a moment they forgot to breathe. After months, for some years, of fighting with blunted practice weapons, the weight of real steel in their hands was intoxicating. Crixus grinned wickedly, testing the balance of a gladius. Now this feels right. But there was no time to savor it. Shouts were starting to rise outside, the commotion drawing curious eyes toward the armory. Spartacus handed out weapons as quickly as he could, stuffing smaller blades into belts and passing shields to the strongest men. Historians still debate exactly how many gladiators took part in the escape. Some say 70, others over 200. What's certain is that their sudden appearance, armed to the teeth, caught the guards completely off guard. The first man to block their path barely had time to shout before Crixus's shield slammed into him, sending him sprawling. The yard exploded into chaos. Trainees who weren't part of the plan scrambled for safety, some joining the fight out of sheer desperation, others hiding behind anything solid. In the midst of it all, Spartacus moved like a man possessed. Every strike, every step, was deliberate, his focus narrowing to a single goal, the open gate. He could see it ahead, framed by the fading light of the evening. Freedom was just beyond if they could reach it. Of course, that was when the real guards showed up. Fully armored, swords drawn, they charged into the fray, and for a moment, the escape seemed doomed. One odd detail from the records claims that at this exact moment, a stray chicken, perhaps escaping from the kitchen, darted across the yard, flapping madly. The sudden distraction made at least 2 guards stumble, which might just be the unlikeliest reason Spartacus lived to fight another day. The clash at the gate was brutal but short. Spartacus and Inamos broke through the line, dragging the cart driver from his seat and tossing him aside. In seconds, the mules were whipped into motion, the heavy cart creaking through the gates with armed gladiators clinging to its sides. Behind them, the school erupted in angry shouts. Batiatus himself was said to have watched from an upper balcony, shouting curses creative enough to make even the guards blush. The road ahead was narrow, winding into the hills. Darkness was falling fast, and with it came their greatest ally, invisibility. But it also meant the Romans would have to hunt them in the open countryside, and that was a dangerous game for anyone to play. Spartacus didn't look back. He couldn't. Every step forward was one step away from the chains, one step toward a life that, until today, had been nothing more than a dream. And if the dream involved a stolen cart, 2 overworked mules, and a lot of very angry Romans, well, nobody ever said freedom was glamorous. By dawn, the ragged band had put miles between themselves and Capua. The road behind them was littered with the memories of their escape: broken spears, dented shields, and oddly enough, a single sandal that no one claimed. The mules, bless them, trudged on with the stoic patience of animals that had seen too much. They reached a bend in the road where the hills rose like sleeping giants, offering pockets of shadow for cover. Spartacus called a halt, his voice low but firm. The men collapsed onto the damp grass, drinking greedily from a nearby stream. Some laughed in disbelief, others stared into the distance, the reality of their situation settling in. They were free, but only for now. Crixus broke the silence with his usual charm. We have swords, we have shields, and we have each other. Unfortunately, we also have no food, no coin, and the entire Roman Republic after us. Gannicus, still looking, a little too pleased with himself after last night's distraction, shrugged. We'll just take what we need. Isn't that the point of being free? It was true, survival meant raiding, and raiding meant making enemies fast. But the alternative was starving in the hills, and that didn't sit well with anyone. The men agreed to split into small groups to scout the surrounding villages, avoiding the main roads. One strange detail preserved in an old account suggests that Spartacus insisted on a quiet approach to foraging, until Crixus returned an hour later carrying an entire smoked pig over his shoulder. When asked how he managed it without alerting anyone, he replied simply, "I didn't." By midday, they had enough supplies to last a few days: bread, dried figs, wine, and of course, the unfortunate pig. The men ate like kings, or at least like kings who had just run 20 miles with Roman steel at their backs. But even as they feasted, Spartacus's mind was elsewhere. He knew the Romans would not waste time. Patrols would be scouring the countryside already, and their best hope lay in moving deeper into the rugged terrain of Mount Vesuvius. The volcano loomed in the distance, its slopes a patchwork of forest and rock. Few dared to venture too far up. The locals whispered about spirits, strange noises, and the occasional rumble from deep within. "Perfect," Spartacus muttered. "The Romans won't follow us somewhere they think is cursed." By late afternoon, the group began the climb. The mules were left behind, their work done, and frankly, their loyalty undeserved after the number of times they'd tried to bite Gannicus. The path was steep, winding past gnarled trees and jagged stones. Every step was a reminder that freedom was hard-earned. and occasionally ankle-twisting. They reached a natural plateau as the sun dipped low. From here, they could see the plains stretching far below, dotted with Roman farms and villas. Smoke from village chimneys curled into the air, peaceful and oblivious to the fugitives hiding above. Inamos scouted the area, returning with news of a small cave system just ahead. The caves were dry, hidden by thick brush, and big enough to house the entire group. Better yet, the view from the entrance offered a perfect vantage point for spotting any approaching soldiers. As night fell, they lit no fires, relying on the stars for light. The men lay in uneasy silence, weapons within arm's reach. Somewhere, in the distance, an owl called, its mournful cry echoing across the hills. Historians still debate whether this was the night Spartacus first conceived of something bigger, not just survival, but an army of the oppressed. In the quiet, with the cold seeping into their bones, it was easy to imagine him staring into the darkness, seeing more than just the next day's escape. Of course, the moment was ruined when Gannicus whispered, "If anyone snores, I'm throwing them down the mountain." The laughter that followed was low and weary, but it carried a spark, the kind of spark that could, given time, ignite into something far greater. Morning came slowly on Mount Vesuvius, the sun climbing over the rim of the volcano like a cautious visitor. The fugitives awoke to the sound of rustling leaves and the faint scent of damp earth. Spartacus stretched, feeling the ache of yesterday's climb settle deep in his muscles. Freedom, it seemed, was heavy work. Their cave was small but secure, the entrance concealed by a curtain of twisted branches. From their vantage point, they could see the valley below, and the thin column of dust rising from the road. "Roman patrol. They're moving fast," Inamos muttered. "They know we're here," Spartacus replied. "Question is, how close can they get before they regret it?" Crixus grinned in that dangerous way that made everyone slightly nervous. "I'd be happy to answer that question." The day was spent scouting the slopes. The terrain was treacherous, loose stones, steep inclines, and thorny undergrowth, but it also offered natural defenses. A narrow path led up to their hideout, the kind of path where a handful of fighters could hold off an army. The men gathered rocks, logs, and anything else they could roll downhill in case of an attack. It was not elegant, but it was effective. Midday brought an unexpected distraction. A goat wandered into camp. It was small, scruffy, and seemed utterly unfazed by the armed men staring at it. Gannicus immediately claimed it as camp mascot and named it Jupiter, declaring that killing it would bring bad luck. Historians still debate whether this was genuine superstition or just Gannicus's way of avoiding another night of fig bread. By late afternoon, scouts returned with news that the Roman patrol had set up camp at the base of the volcano. The soldiers seemed cautious, sending only small search parties up the slopes. This gave Spartacus an idea, one that involved more daring than food in their bellies. "We wait until nightfall," he told them. "Then we visit our new neighbors." The plan was simple in theory, insane in execution. Under the cover of darkness, the rebels would creep down the slope, strike the patrol's camp, and vanish before the Romans could react. Every man knew the risks. One wrong step, one careless noise, and they'd be cut down in the dark. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. The group prepared in silence, tightening straps, checking blades, and smearing ash on their faces. Even Jupiter the goat seemed to sense something was about to happen, though it was unclear whether he approved. When the last light faded, they began their descent. The night was quiet, except for the crunch of gravel underfoot. Shadows clung to the rocks, masking their movements. The Roman camp came into view, tents clustered around a fire, guards pacing with lazy familiarity. At signal, they struck. The attack was fast and brutal in its precision. Tents slashed, supplies scattered, guards knocked unconscious before they could raise an alarm. One strange account claims that Crixus took the time to steal a pair of expensive Roman boots during the chaos, boots he wore proudly for the rest of the campaign. Within minutes, it was over. The rebels vanished back into the darkness, leaving the Romans scrambling in confusion. Back in the cave, the spoils were divided: fresh bread, cured meat, and, most importantly, a bundle of real Roman swords. The laughter that night was sharper, edged with triumph. They had struck the enemy and lived to tell the tale. Spartacus sat apart, staring into the night. He could feel the momentum building like the slow roll of a boulder that would soon be unstoppable. somewhere below, the Romans were licking their wounds. Up here, in the shadow of the volcano, the spark of rebellion burned a little brighter. The morning after the raid felt different, lighter, even though the rebels were still sleeping on cold rock and eating bread that could break a tooth. Victory had that effect. Men who once kept to themselves now shared jokes, slapped each other on the back, and argued loudly about who would hit the hardest during the night's chaos. Spartacus knew better than to let the mood drift into overconfidence. They're Romans, he reminded them. They don't like being embarrassed. They'll come back, and they'll bring friends. Inemos was already sharpening his blade. Then, we'll be ready. Ready or not, news of the raid spread faster than wildfire. Within days, small groups of escaped slaves, shepherds, and runaway debtors began trickling up the slopes of Vesuvius. Most came with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Some carried crude farm tools, and a few even brought bows. The camp grew crowded, noisy, and, as Gannicus complained loudly, smellier by the hour. One odd arrival was a potter named Cassius, who claimed to have once made fine tableware for a Roman senator. Instead of offering his sword arm, he set up a small clay workshop in a corner of the camp. Nobody knew why until he presented Spartacus with a lopsided drinking cup, etched with the words "property of no man." Historians still debate whether this was genuine artistry or just the ugliest mug in ancient Italy. But with more people came more mouths to feed. The stolen supplies from the Roman camp dwindled quickly. Foraging parties were sent out, often returning with figs, olives, and occasionally a confused chicken or two. Hunting was difficult on the rocky slopes, though one particularly determined group brought back a wild boar, minus most of its meat, which they sheepishly admitted had been shared with some hungry villagers on the way up. Spartacus understood the bigger picture. They weren't just a gang of fugitives anymore. They were becoming an army, an untrained, poorly armed, and occasionally goat-obsessed army, but an army nonetheless, and armies attracted attention. Sure enough, the watchman spotted movement in the valley one afternoon. Roman soldiers again, this time in greater numbers. At their head marched a man named Gaius Claudius Glaber, a praetor sent to end the rebellion. Before it could spread, Glaber's strategy was simple: trap the rebels on the mountain and starve them out. He ordered his men to block the only path leading down in the camp. Tension tightened like a bowstring. Crixus wanted to charge down immediately. Inemos suggested waiting until the Romans got bored and left. Spartacus, however, saw an opportunity in Glaber's arrogance. "They think we're trapped," he said. "Let's make them believe it, until we're ready to show them otherwise." The plan he outlined sounded absurd. Braid vines into long ropes, lowered themselves down the sheer cliff face on the opposite side of the mountain, circled behind the Romans, and attacked their camp from the rear. It was dangerous, exhausting, and exactly the kind of move the Romans would never expect. The rebels set to work gathering vines, stripping them of leaves, and knotting them together. The camp buzzed with nervous energy, the men working side by side in a rare show of unity. Even Jupiter the goat seemed unusually quiet, as if he sensed the importance of what was coming. Night fell, and the cliff loomed like a wall against the stars. One by one, the rebels lowered themselves down, the ropes creaking under their weight. Hands burned, feet slipped, but no one fell. At the base, they regrouped and began their silent march toward Glaber's camp. The Romans were unprepared for the onslaught that followed. Tents collapsed, fires were kicked apart, and startled soldiers fled in every direction. Crixus, of course, made a point of finding Glaber's tent and leaving a particularly rude message carved into the wooden post. By dawn, the rebels were gone, carrying with them weapons, food, and the kind of victory that turned whispers into shouts across Italy. On the mountain, they feasted on stolen bread and roasted meat. Spartacus allowed himself a small smile. The Romans had underestimated them again, and it had cost them dearly. The days after Glaber's humiliating defeat were like a festival on the mountain. The rebels strutted around in their newly acquired Roman armor, some of which didn't fit at all. One ex-farmer wore a helmet so large it kept sliding down over his eyes, another used his as a cooking pot. Inemos muttered that they were turning into a traveling circus rather than an army. Yet the victory brought more than just laughter. It brought people, and lots of them. Word of Spartacus's daring escape and surprise attack spread across the countryside like spilled wine. Men and women from distant estates, farms, and workshops risked everything to join them. Some carried stories of cruel masters, Others simply wanted a chance to strike back at Rome. One particularly unusual recruit was a shepherd named Publius, who arrived leading a flock of sheep. He insisted the animals could smell trouble and would serve as an early warning system. This claim was immediately proven false when the sheep panicked at the sight of a small lizard. Historians still debate whether Publius was a visionary or just very attached to his livestock. Spartacus now found himself leading a force of over 1,000 people. They were still short on proper weapons, but their spirits were high, and for the first time they began to talk seriously about the future. Crixus wanted to march straight to Capua and take the city. Inimaus urged caution, reminding everyone that Rome was now fully aware of the rebellion. Spartacus listened, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "Every Roman city is a cage," he said. "We break into one, they'll send an army to trap us inside. We need to move where they least expect." That decision came sooner than expected. Scouts reported a new Roman force approaching, this time led by Praetor Publius Varinius, a man who prided himself on discipline and military precision. Varinius divided his troops into smaller detachments to cover more ground, thinking it would prevent the rebels from slipping past him. Spartacus saw the flaw immediately. Over the next few weeks, the rebels became shadows in the hills, striking isolated Roman detachments and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. They moved at night, slept in hidden valleys, and carried only what they could eat or fight with. The terrain was their shield, and the Romans were chasing ghosts. During one such raid, the rebels captured a wagon full of wine barrels meant for a Roman officer's celebration. Spartacus ordered the wine hidden to keep discipline in the camp, but Gannicus accidentally discovered one barrel already open. The resulting evening was loud, chaotic, and memorable for the moment when Jupiter the goat was found wearing a Roman helmet and sleeping inside a tent. Still, these victories were more than pranks. Each ambush weakened Varinius's hold on the region and strengthened the rebels' belief that they could win. Supplies flowed in, and for the first time, they had enough weapons for nearly every fighter. But Rome was learning. Varinius began moving with greater caution, setting traps and guarding his supply lines more heavily. One skirmish ended with the rebels narrowly escaping an encirclement, a reminder that while they were winning battles, the war was far from over. That night, as the camp settled under a blanket of stars, Spartacus walked the perimeter alone. The laughter and clatter of cooking pots faded behind him. He thought about the families they had freed, the friends they had lost, and the storm that was surely coming. Rome would not forgive them. Rome would not forget, but then again neither would they. By the time winter's chill began to creep into the valleys, Spartacus's army had swelled to several thousand strong. It was no longer a ragged band of escapees. It was becoming a force the Roman Senate could not dismiss as an embarrassment. The Senate, of course, did what senates do best. They argued about it for weeks before agreeing to send more troops. Varinius, still smarting from being outmaneuvered in the hills, now tried a different approach. Instead of hunting Spartacus in open terrain, he moved to block the main roads, hoping to starve the rebels into submission. He fortified key passes, set up outposts, and spread rumors in nearby towns to discourage locals from helping the runaway slaves. It was a clever strategy in theory. In practice, Spartacus simply refused to play along. He began raiding the very outposts Varinius built, often using tricks that would have made a street performer proud. In one instance, a small rebel unit, dressed in stolen Roman armor, marched right up to a checkpoint, claiming to be reinforcements. By the time the guards realized something was wrong, the reinforcements had tied them up and stolen everything, from their swords to their socks. Crixus found these antics hilarious. Inimaus, less so. "A soldier fights with discipline," he scolded, "not with costumes and jokes." Still, even he had to admit the results were effective. Meanwhile, life in the rebel camp had taken on an odd rhythm. There were regular drills, yes, but also impromptu wrestling matches, shared cooking fires, and debates over which region's bread was the best. Gannicus continued to win drinking contests without trying, while the shepherd Publius tried to train his sheep to follow commands like attack and retreat. This, predictably, failed. One cold morning, scouts brought news that made the camp go still. Varinius himself was nearby with a sizable detachment, camped on a plateau. It was an opportunity too good to ignore. Spartacus planned a nighttime climb up the cliffs, a maneuver as dangerous as it was bold. The ascent was slow and silent. the only sounds being the scrape of sandals on rock and the occasional muffled curse. At the top, the rebels fanned out, like shadows, creeping into the Roman camp before the sentries even knew they were there. What followed was not a long battle, it was a rout. The Romans, taken completely off guard, fled into the darkness, leaving behind weapons, supplies, and enough cloaks to keep the rebels warm for the rest of winter. In the aftermath, Spartacus stood at the edge of the plateau, looking down at the valley below where torches flickered like fireflies. "We can win," he murmured, not to anyone in particular, perhaps to himself. But the night brought another kind of victory, morale. The rebels feasted, sang, and even tried on the Roman cloaks in mock fashion shows. One man strutted around, declaring himself praetor of the mountain, which drew enough laughter to echo down the cliffs. Yet, amid the celebration, Spartacus felt the weight of what was coming. This victory would sting Verenius, but it would also infuriate Rome, and Rome had far more soldiers than they had cliffs to climb. Historians still debate whether Spartacus fully understood that the rebellion was now too large to simply vanish into the hills, but on that cold night, as the fires burned low, he seemed to know. His eyes were fixed not on the valley below, but on a horizon no one else could see. Spring brought with it the green smell of new grass and the distant thunder of marching feet. Rome was done treating the revolt as a minor embarrassment. They sent out 2 full consular armies, each commanded by a praetor with more confidence than cautioned at the first. Under Gellius, moved south with the kind of pomp only Rome could muster, banners flapping, trumpets blaring, and soldiers convinced they were about to swat a nuisance. The second, led by Lentulus, positioned itself to cut off any retreat northward. It was a classic pincer movement, and if Spartacus had been just another rebel leader, it might have worked. But Spartacus was not just another anything. He understood that the only way out was through, and so he decided to meet Gellius head-on before Lentulus could close the trap. The battle was set in a rolling meadow, its tall grasses swaying in the breeze like an innocent bystander pretending not to notice the 2 armies facing each other. Spartacus's men, though fewer in number, had the advantage of speed and a leader who refused to stick to a predictable plan. At first, the Romans advanced confidently. They formed their famous tight formations, shields locking like an iron wall, but Spartacus's front line split in 2, peeling away as if in retreat. Gellius's men surged forward, eager to press the advantage, only to be flanked by hidden rebel units charging from the sides. It was chaos. Romans tripped over their own shield lines. Rebels swung from the higher ground with the momentum of wildcats. Even the sheep that Publius had been training unsuccessfully, mind you, ended up on the field, running in random patterns and thoroughly confusing several legionaries. Within an hour, Gellius's army was broken. His survivors ran, abandoning the meadow to the rebels. Spartacus didn't linger. He knew Lentulus was somewhere behind, moving fast. Sure enough, the second Roman army appeared within days, hoping to crush the rebels before they could regroup. Spartacus, his men still flushed with their recent victory, didn't give them the chance. He attacked before dawn, charging through the mist like a phantom wave. Lentulus's lines collapsed even faster than Gellius's. It turned into a running fight down the hillsides, with rebels chasing Roman soldiers who had clearly reconsidered their career choices to Roman armies, both rooted in the space of a single campaign. The news spread faster than a tavern rumor. Towns that once shut their gates to Spartacus now opened them, eager to trade food for Roman weapons or simply to watch the spectacle. In the rebel camp that night, the mood was somewhere between celebration and disbelief. Even Crixus, usually a barrel of bravado, admitted he hadn't expected to humiliate 2 praetors in a week. Gannicus raised a cup and declared, "If we beat one more, we'll have to start charging Rome rent for using their soldiers." Still, there was tension. Victories like these brought Rome's pride into question, and nothing made the Republic more dangerous than a wounded ego. Spartacus knew they would come back, and next time, it wouldn't be with praetors, it would be with consuls, or worse. Historians still debate whether Spartacus considered marching directly on Rome at this moment. Some believe he saw the capital as too heavily defended. Others think he wanted to avoid turning the revolt into an all-out war he couldn't win. Whatever the truth, he chose to move north, leading his people toward the Alps and what he hoped would be freedom. The problem was, not everyone agreed on the destination, and soon, disagreements would do what? Roman swords could not. The Alps loomed in the distance like a promise, jagged, snow-capped, and shimmering under the late spring sun. For Spartacus, they were more than mountains. They were the doorway home. Beyond them lay Gaul, Thrace, and a chance for his people to vanish into the lands of their birth. But not everyone shared that vision. Around the campfires at night, the murmurs began. Some, especially the Gauls under Crixus's command, wanted to stay in Italy. Why run, they argued. Rome bleeds. Let us finish the job. Others, tasting the spoils of victory, saw Italy as a ripe orchard they hadn't finished plundering. Spartacus listened, patient but troubled. He knew the Alps weren't just a path to freedom, they were also the last exit before Rome brought down the full weight of its legions. It was during one of these tense evenings that the argument boiled over. Crixus, ever the fiery brawler, slammed his cup down and declared that he and his men would not slink away like thieves in the night. "We've beaten their armies twice. Why not make them kneel?" he said, his voice carrying across the camp. Gannicus tried to diffuse the tension with humor, suggesting they send Rome a politely worded note, signed with goat hoofprints, but the laughter was thin. The split was real. In the end, Crixus took about 30,000 men and broke away from the main force, marching south in search of more glory. Spartacus, though furious at the fracture, let him go. He suspected it would end badly, and sadly, he was right. News came within weeks. Crixus's army had been caught near Mount Garganus by a full Roman force. The battle was brutal, and though Crixus fought like a man possessed, reportedly cutting down a dozen Romans himself, he and most of his men were slaughtered. When word reached Spartacus, the mood in camp turned to stone. Even those who had disagreed with Crixus felt the loss. Spartacus ordered a solemn memorial. He had 300 captured Romans forced to fight in pairs to the death, not for the rebels' amusement, but as a grim funeral rite for Crixus, echoing the gladiatorial games of their former lives. The irony was not lost on anyone. They had once been made to fight for the pleasure of others. Now, they were making Romans do the same. It was justice, of a particularly unsettling flavor. After the funeral games, Spartacus renewed the march north. The mountains drew closer, the air growing cooler with each passing day. His scouts brought back stories of quiet mountain passes and small villages that could offer shelter. Yet, there were signs Rome was moving faster. Crassus, a man whose wealth could buy entire provinces, had been given command. Unlike the previous commanders, Crassus didn't underestimate his enemy. He was building a fortified line across the Italian peninsula, a wall of men, trenches, and stakes to keep Spartacus penned in. Historians still debate whether Spartacus hesitated at this point because of the snow in the passes, the loyalty of his men, or a final, dangerous temptation, the possibility of turning back south, not to fight Rome directly, but to strike at its richest cities. Whatever his reasons, the march slowed. Campfires burned longer each night, and the songs of victory turned to quieter, more thoughtful tunes. In the stillness, Spartacus often stood alone, staring at the faint white peaks, as if wondering whether freedom lay beyond them, or if they were simply the edge of a trap he had walked into. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like a ghost unwilling to leave. Spartacus's army woke to a sharp chill in the air and the faint echo of hammering, Roman hammering. Word spread quickly. Crassus's wall was almost complete. It wasn't a wall in the grand sense, like something out of legend. This was a brutal, practical barrier, deep trenches, sharpened stakes, and fortified camps stretching from sea to sea across the narrowest part of southern Italy. Any attempt to cross would be like charging into the jaws of a trap lined with spears. Spartacus paced before his captains, his brow furrowed. He laid out their two grim choices: smash through Crassus's lines now, before they were fully reinforced, or remain in the south and risk being slowly starved into submission. Neither option was inviting. To make matters worse, food supplies were dwindling. The countryside had been stripped bare by months of war, and the local villagers were either hiding their grain or running to the Romans for protection. Soldiers joked in that dark gallows way that their stew now had more hope than meat. Still, Spartacus was not the kind of man to sit idle. He ordered a sudden night assault on one section of the Roman fortifications. The attack was ferocious. Rebels swarmed over the trenches, hurling torches and shouting war cries. For a moment, It seemed they might break through until Crassus's disciplined ranks pushed them back with deadly precision. The rebels retreated into the darkness, their losses heavy. Crassus had proven what Spartacus already feared. This Roman was no amateur. But there was one advantage Spartacus still held: unpredictability. The very next night, under a moon barely visible through the clouds, Spartacus gathered a picked force of men, along with ropes, ladders, and a few hundred terrified donkeys. Don't ask where they came from. Even the quartermasters looked confused. They moved quietly along the coastline, avoiding direct contact with Roman patrols, and then, in an audacious move that would make later historians shake their heads, they crossed the trenches by hauling the donkeys over first, then using them to carry gear across. Roman sentries, startled by the bizarre sight of laden donkeys in the dark, hesitated just long enough for Spartacus's men to slip through. By dawn, the main rebel force had passed the fortifications entirely. Crassus awoke to find his prey gone, and his fortifications mocked in campfire songs for days afterward. For a brief moment, the road north was open again. Spirits lifted. The snow-tipped mountains seemed closer than ever, and even the most battle-weary rebels began to imagine the taste of home. But then came the whispers. Pompey, the great general, fresh from victories in Spain, had been ordered back to Italy. He was marching south with another Roman army. If Crassus's wall was the trap's jaw, Pompey would be the snapping teeth. Historians still debate whether this was the moment Spartacus's fate was sealed. Was he truly trapped between two of Rome's greatest generals? Or could he still have found a way through? The truth may lie buried in the mud of those Italian fields. For now, the rebels pushed on, their pace quickening. They moved like a river in flood, fast, unpredictable, and dangerous. But even the mightiest river eventually finds its course blocked, and somewhere in the distance, the steady drumbeat of Roman boots grew louder. The air grew sharper as Spartacus's column moved north. The breath of men and horses hanging in the early morning chill, like faint ghosts trailing behind them. The rebels pressed forward with a kind of stubborn hope, each day putting more distance between themselves and Crassus's wall. But hope, as they were learning, had a frustrating habit of crumbling when you needed it most, because somewhere ahead, Pompey was coming. Pompey Magnus, the Great, was a name that carried the weight of half the known world. Fresh from victories in Spain, his legions were seasoned, rested, and eager to add another feather to their general's cap. Rome didn't just want Spartacus defeated now. It wanted him crushed so thoroughly that no slave, anywhere, would dare dream of rebellion again. Scouts brought back grim news. Pompey's forces were closing in faster than expected. This left Spartacus in the worst position imaginable. Crassus behind, Pompey ahead, and only a ragged strip of Italy in between. It was like being in a long hallway with two angry bulls charging from opposite ends. Still, Spartacus refused to stand still. He wheeled his army eastward, hoping to strike at smaller Roman garrisons, replenish supplies, and keep both generals guessing. This worked for a while. Villages fell quickly, storehouses were emptied, and the rebels even managed to capture a Roman supply column carrying salted pork, wine, and oddly enough, an entire shipment of fine sandals. Soldiers later joked that they might die in battle, but at least they'd look fashionable doing it. Crassus, frustrated by his quarry's evasions, pushed his men harder, building temporary forts along the march to keep Spartacus from doubling back. Pompey, meanwhile, was sweeping down from the north, his scouts fanning out to choke every possible escape route. The noose was tightening, and everyone knew it. In one particularly bold maneuver, Spartacus tried to lure Crassus into overextending by feinting toward the mountains, then suddenly doubling back toward the coast. For a brief, glorious 2 days, the Romans lost track of his exact position, and the rebels celebrated by roasting stolen chickens over open fires, as though the war was already won. But celebration turned to tension when a rider galloped in from the forward scouts, breathless and pale. Pompey's vanguard was now less than 2 days away. Around the campfires that night, the talk was quieter than usual. Men stared into the flames, sharpening weapons or clutching small tokens from home. Historians still debate whether Spartacus ever truly believed he could break free after that point, or if he was simply leading his men toward the best fight they could manage before the end. Spartacus, for his part, walked the camp, speaking to the men not like a distant commander but like one of them. He reminded them of the victories they had snatched from the jaws of defeat, of the chains they had shattered, of the masters who once thought them nothing more than tools. His voice was calm, steady, even when his eyes betrayed the weight of what was coming. That night, under a sky heavy with stars, a strange quiet settled over the camp. There were no drunken songs, no bursts of laughter, only the low murmur of men preparing themselves for whatever came next. Somewhere out there, 2 Roman generals were closing in, and when morning came, there would be no more clever escapes. Morning broke with a pale gold light that painted the hills, but the beauty of it was wasted on the rebels. Scouts returned before breakfast with the confirmation everyone dreaded. Pompey's cavalry had been spotted less than a day's march to the north, and Crassus's forces, they were close enough that the sound of their trumpets sometimes echoed faintly across the valleys. Spartacus gathered his lieutenants in a grove of wind-bent pines. The meeting was brief. There was no time for speeches or elaborate plans. "We fight," he said simply, his voice carrying the tone of a man who had already made peace with the decision. The army moved quickly, seeking higher ground where their smaller numbers might count for more. The chosen site was a ridge overlooking a narrow pass, a place where the Romans' numerical advantage could be blunted, if only for a while. The rebels worked like ants, digging shallow trenches, piling stones, and setting sharpened stakes in the earth. Every man and woman knew this would likely be their final stand, but strangely, that knowledge seemed to focus them rather than break them. Odd details stuck out in the frenzy of preparation. One old Gaulish fighter spent half an hour trying to carve a crude bird into his spear shaft. Another man insisted on wearing the 2 small sandals they'd stolen weeks before, declaring he'd rather die with blisters than barefoot. And somewhere in the chaos, someone roasted an onion on a stick over the campfire, a smell that was bizarrely comforting amid the scent of oil, leather, and sweat. By midday, the first of Pompey's skirmishers appeared at the edge of the pass, testing the rebels' defenses. They came in small waves at first, darting in with javelins before retreating. Spartacus forbade his men from chasing them. "Save your strength," he warned. "The storm hasn't even started." And the storm did come. From the south, Crassus's legionaries appeared in ordered ranks, their shields flashing like a wall of bronze teeth. From the north, Pompey's banners rose over the ridgeline. The 2 Roman armies hadn't come to join forces in friendship. They'd come to compete for the kill. Whoever destroyed Spartacus would win the glory in Rome. It was a nightmare for the rebels, caught between 2 disciplined, well-supplied forces. Their only advantage was the narrowness of the pass and their own desperate resolve. The fighting began in earnest by late afternoon, with Pompey's troops hammering the front lines, while Crassus's cavalry tried to work around the flanks. Amid the chaos, Spartacus could be seen everywhere, rallying a faltering line here, dragging a wounded comrade to safety there. At one point, he seized a fallen Roman's spear and hurled it with such force that it punched through a legionary's shield and into the man's chest. This drew a roar from the rebels, and for a moment they pushed forward, forcing Pompey's men back down the slope. But victories came in seconds now, and defeats in minutes. By evening, the rebels were exhausted, their lines fraying under the relentless pressure. Spartacus gave the order to pull back toward the inner ridge, buying them a little more time. Historians still debate whether this was a calculated move to prepare for a night breakout, or simply an instinct to survive a few hours longer. As darkness fell, the sounds of battle gave way to the groans of the wounded, and the occasional shouted order from the Roman camps. Fires dotted the hillsides like a cruel constellation, marking the armies that would close in fully come morning. In the quiet moments before sleep, some rebels sharpened blades, others whispered prayers to gods they barely remembered from home. Spartacus stood alone for a while, staring at the distant glow of Pompey's campfires. Somewhere in his eyes there was a flicker, not of fear, but of defiance. If tomorrow was to be the end, it would not come cheaply. The dawn of the final day came with no fanfare, only the cold bite of wind sweeping over the ridge. There was no breakfast this morning. What little food remained had been saved for the wounded, though many of them would never rise to eat it. Spartacus moved through the camp slowly, checking each knot of fighters. His voice was calm, even warm at times, like a man making sure everyone knew where the exits were before the building caught fire. The Romans began their advance earlier than expected. Crassus's legions marched in heavy blocks, shields locked, spears angled forward like a living machine. From the opposite side, Pompey's men moved with equal precision, closing the trap. The rebels had nowhere to retreat, only the steep cliff edges, where a fall would mean a quicker death than a Roman sword. When the first wave hit, the noise was deafening. Shields clashed, spears splintered, and the air was thick with the grunt and roar of close combat. Spartacus fought in the center, where the line threatened to buckle. His sword seemed to move faster than his body should have allowed, cutting, parrying, striking, all in a rhythm he had honed from years of both survival and performance. At times, he looked more like a gladiator in the arena than a general on the battlefield, only this audience wasn't cheering. A strange sight broke through the chaos. A young Thracian boy, barely old enough to carry a shield, was shouting insults at a Roman officer in Latin so mangled it made his comrades laugh, even as they fought. Moments later, the boy vanished into the crush of bodies, but for a brief second, he had reminded them all of their shared stubbornness. By midday, the ridge was slick with mud and blood, though, as per bedtime story rules, we'll say it was just battlefield sauce. The rebels were being pushed back foot by foot. Pompey's cavalry had found a way around the left flank, cutting down any who tried to escape. Spartacus, seeing the collapse coming, made a decision that would define his legend. Gathering his closest fighters, he pointed not toward retreat, but straight at the heart of Crassus's formation. "With me," he shouted, and they surged forward in a wedge. The sudden charge caught the Romans off guard, driving deep into their lines. For a heartbeat, it seemed possible maybe they could reach Crassus himself and force a moment of chaos. They never did. The Roman ranks closed in like a vice, surrounding the rebel wedge. Spartacus fought with the ferocity of a man who understood that every breath might be his last, cutting down one soldier, then another. Even Roman accounts admitted he slew many before being overwhelmed. Whether he fell from a spear, thrust, an arrow, or simply exhaustion, is lost to history. Historians still debate if his body was ever found at all. By late afternoon, the battle was over. The ridge was littered with broken shields and silent fighters. A few rebels managed to slip away into the hills, but the war, for all intents, had ended. Pompey would send word to Rome claiming victory, while Crassus would argue the same. Neither would speak much of the sheer stubbornness that had made this fight so costly. In the Roman camp that evening, there was celebration. In the empty rebel camp, there was only the sound of wind over the discarded weapons. Somewhere, far from the battlefield, the dream of freedom Spartacus had kindled would live on in whispers. The days after the battle were grim for those who survived. Roman patrols swept the countryside, rounding up escaped rebels. Most were executed swiftly, though swiftly in Roman terms still involved crucifixion along the Appian Way, a chilling reminder to anyone tempted to challenge the Republic again. The road from Capua to Rome became a line of wooden crosses, each one bearing a silent figure, their defiance now reduced to stillness. Pompey and Crassus both sent their victory reports to the Senate, each framing the defeat of Spartacus as their own doing. The Senate, of course, smiled politely and pretended to believe both. Politics in Rome was just another kind of gladiator match, except with more togas and fewer swords. For the common people, the story of Spartacus was already becoming legend. In taverns, they whispered about how he'd broken through Roman lines, or how his spirit had been carried away by the gods. Some claimed he had never died at all, but vanished into the hills to fight another day. That's the thing about revolts, they may be crushed, but their echoes keep walking around long after the soldiers go home. One strange detail emerged in later retellings. A Roman soldier swore he saw Spartacus smiling in the thick of battle, as if he knew something the rest of them didn't. Historians still debate whether this was just poetic exaggeration, but it's the kind of image that refuses to die. In the years that followed, Rome would have other wars, other revolts, and other names to fear, but none would capture the imagination quite like Spartacus, the gladiator who had dared to march an army of the forgotten to the very gates of the Republic. The final lullaby. And now, dear listener, it's time to put down our swords and step away from the battlefield. Imagine the noise fading, the clanging metal replaced by the soft chirp of night insects, the shouting replaced by the hush of wind through distant olive trees. The moon hangs low over a quiet countryside, its light silvering the gentle slopes and the leaves of tall cypress. Somewhere far from the main roads, in a little valley no map bothers to name, there's a campfire glowing faintly. Around it sit a handful of weary travelers, not warriors anymore, just people. They lean back, warmed by the flames, the crackle of burning wood, a slow, steady rhythm. Above them, the stars scatter themselves across the sky, unbothered by the struggles of men. One by one, their eyes close, their breathing slows. The fire burns low but never quite goes out, casting just enough light to keep away the dark. And in that warm, quiet glow, the world is safe enough for sleep. So let the day's battles drift away. Let the night hold you, and may you dream, not of war, but of open fields, clear skies, and mornings where the only sound is the laughter of those you love. Good night.